At the culmination of Jesus' journey on earth, there is a unique and deeply revealing moment, the Transfiguration. This event, which takes place on a mountaintop, marks a supernatural and divine experience that changes the course of the disciples' understanding of Jesus. Today, let's explore what happened on that mountain and what it means for our faith. Imagine the scenario. Jesus, that man with authority who until then had performed impressive miracles, now chooses 3 disciples nearby Peter, James, and John to an event that would change their perception irreversibly. They know this moment will be different, but what exactly is coming, no one knew. Why did Jesus choose these 3? They were the closest, the most trusted among the 12, and perhaps they were most prepared to witness such a profound and supernatural revelation. Jesus' decision to take only these 3 may also suggest something about the individual call. He knew that not all the disciples were ready to understand what would happen on the mountain. Pedro, Tiago, and João represented a special trust, and they would be the fundamentals of the early church. It is interesting to think about intimacy of Jesus with these men, who had been his closest companions in other situations of great significance, such as the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus asked them to stay with him in prayer. As they climbed the mountain, a feeling of expectation hovered in the air. The climb was arduous, but the reward that the disciples imagined at the top could be immense. They didn't know exactly what awaited them, but they felt something extraordinary was about to happen. With every step, the feeling of mystery increased. The top of the mountain, often a place of divine revelations in Scripture, it seemed like the perfect setting for the moment that was about to unfold. Like anyone going on a journey of faith and hope, the disciples may have been thinking, what will God reveal to us here? The walk, however, was not just physical, it was also spiritual. Every step taken toward the top was also a movement toward a deeper understanding of who Jesus really was. The transition from a Jesus human and accessible for the divine and glorified Christ was about to happen, and the disciples were being prepared, though unknowingly, to see the unveil the divine mystery. Finally, when they reached the top of the mountain, what happened there exceeded any expectations. What seemed like a simple moment of prayer and retreat turned into a manifestation supernatural and immeasurable of the presence of God. Suddenly, physical reality was overflowed by celestial reality, as if the sky itself had opened before them. The atmosphere was permeated with divine light, and the disciples, speechless, could only watch in silence as the glory of God was revealed in a way they had never experienced before. While Jesus was praying on the top of the mountain, something extraordinary had happened. What seemed like an ordinary prayer turned into an event supernatural. Jesus, in front of his disciples, began to transfigure. Your face shone like the sun, radiating a light so intense that no human being could ever look directly at it without being blinded. To the Jesus clothes became white as light, a whiteness so pure it defied human description. It was a light that did not come from outside, but emanated from Jesus' own being, a divine glory revealed in his human flesh. That transfiguration, it was a confirmation explosive of the divinity of Jesus. He was not just a teacher or prophet, but the Son of God, with incomparable power and glory. What the disciples were seeing was not a simple man, but a manifestation of divine purity, one eternity exhibition which had been compressed into the human form of Jesus. It was her own glory of God, an inaccessible and infinite light, now visible to human eyes. Something completely new that made everything around, even reality itself, seemed to fade away before its magnitude. And the surprise didn't stop there. As if the vision of radiant Jesus wasn't enough, suddenly, 2 giants of biblical history appeared with him, Moses and Elias. The fact that these 2 characters were chosen to manifest alongside Jesus was not a coincidence, but a powerful theological statement. Moses, the great lawgiver of Israel, the man who brought law, represented the ancient alliance what God did with his people. Elias, one of Israel's greatest prophets, represented the prophets and compliance with messianic promises. Both were there, talking to Jesus, reinforcing the message that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Scriptures. He was to you the prophets and the promise of salvation in one person. The disciples were astonished. It was impossible to describe the magnitude of the vision. The presence of Moses and Elijah, plus the radiant transfiguration of Jesus, created an atmosphere impressive with reverence. That moment was loaded with profound meanings. The continuity of God's promises, now finally revealed in Jesus, the Messiah. Let's imagine a mix of feelings that Peter, James, and John were experiencing. A reverent fear before divine glory, but also a deep admiration and a desire to preserve that moment. They were faced with something beyond any human experience. It was as if heaven itself had descended to earth and manifested itself before their eyes. There were no words to describe it. One could only to feel. Pedro, moved by emotion and surprise, finds himself impelled to speak, trying to express what he himself did not understand. "Lord, it's good to be here," he says, even suggesting the construction of tents, as if he wanted to perpetuate that glorious experience. But Pedro's proposal, although impulsive, revealed more than an attempt to physically organize what they were seeing. He wanted to preserve that supernatural moment, maintain that divine revelation in a human structure. He, like all of us, was trying to understand the impossible within human logic. At this point, a bright cloud involved them, and the voice of God was heard from heaven. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." This voice not only reaffirms the divinity of Jesus, but also his unique mission. Jesus is the Son of God, and he must be heard above all. It is not the words of Moses or Elijah that matter most, but the words of Jesus. The good states that final authority rests with the Son, and the disciples' response must be to listen and obey. It was the last revelation, the last confirmation. Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and nothing and no one should divert the attention of his disciples. They were now, not only as disciples, but as witnesses of something ineffable, which would change the way they would see Jesus forever. Pedro, as usual, he couldn't contain his excitement at this celestial spectacle. He was, without a doubt, the most impulsive of the disciples, someone who often spoke his mind, without measuring the consequences of his words. There, on the Mount of Transfiguration, he stood before something unimaginable. Jesus transfigured in all his divine glory, surrounded by Moses and Elijah, two of the most revered figures in the Old Testament. What his eyes saw was not something you saw every day. Heaven itself seemed to have descended to earth, and Pedro, in the midst of this wonder, felt driven to act. Looking at that stunning scenery, Pedro, perhaps trying to make sense of it all, and still trying to process what was happening, it says, "Lord, it's good to be here. If you wish, we will make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Matthew 17, verse 4. This proposal, however spontaneous and well-intentioned it seemed, reveals more than simply an emotional reaction on Pedro's part. The suggestion to build 3 tents reflects a human desire to preserve the moment, of attach the divine to the physical, trying to make that transcendent moment into something more understandable and lasting. In other words, Peter wanted to make that celestial encounter become something tangible, something fixed, perhaps even comforting for him and his companions. By asking to build tents, he was suggesting an attempt to become familiar with the sacred, of bringing the mystery of divine glory to a higher level, close and safe, a place of comfort amidst the unimaginable. This desire to preserve the moment, it was not exclusive to Pedro. Many of us, faced with intense and transformative spiritual experiences, want to keep these moments forever. The difference is that while we often try to control these experiences, Pedro, without fully understanding the depth of what he was seeing, was trying to keep the uncontrollable in a form he could understand. Your proposal, while revealing your excitement and emotion, also shows a lack of understanding about the purpose of vision and about the role of Jesus as the Messiah. Jesus didn't need tents. He didn't come to be encapsulated in an experience, but for transform lives in a way that went beyond human expectations. Peter, like all of us, wanted to stay there in the glorious presence of Jesus, trying to maintain what seemed to be the culmination of divine revelation. But his proposal was, in fact, an attempt to stay stuck in the past, to try freeze the moment. And that, unfortunately, would not be God's purpose in that event. Before Pedro could say more or try to explain his proposal, something surprising happens. A bright cloud surrounds them, and the voice of God the Father resounds from heaven, interrupting any attempt by Peter to control or fix that experience. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Matthew 17, verse 5. God's answer could not be clearer. The voice of the Father descends from heaven and declares the supremacy of Jesus in an irrevocable way. He not only confirms the divine identity of Jesus, but also dispels any idea that Jesus could be reduced to a simple human or mystical figure. Jesus was not just a prophet like Moses and Elijah. He was the Son of God, and the presence of Moses and Elijah at his side was to emphasize that Jesus was not just one of the prophets or one more historical figure. He was the fulfillment of everything that Moses and Elijah represented. The voice of God also brings a clear command. Listen to him. This was not only an acknowledgement of Jesus' authority, but an invitation to obedience. Jesus' mission was not just to be seen. It was not to be captured in an ephemeral experience. Jesus should be heard, and his words should be obeyed. Listen to Jesus becomes the key to understanding the divine plan and achieving salvation. By interrupting Peter, God emphasizes that the glorious experience on the mountain could not be dissociated of the central purpose of Jesus' mission. The Transfiguration was not an isolated experience, but a point of confirmation that the Jesus mission was much deeper and it was intimately connected with his future sacrifice. God's statement rejects any attempt to stagnate the mountain experience and challenges the disciples to look for the future, for the greater purpose of Jesus, his death, resurrection, and other salvation of humanity. The moment of transfiguration, then, carries a deep symbolism that goes far beyond the glorification of Jesus before the disciples. The light that emanated from Jesus and the whiteness of his clothes were not mere physical phenomena. They symbolized the divine presence, which in several parts of the scriptures is associated with God himself. The light was a representation of the pure character of Jesus, from his uncompromising holiness and from full revelation of God in the person of the Son. The whiteness of Jesus' clothing can also be seen as an expression of his pureza and immaculate perfection, without stain or sin. It's the manifestation of his divine nature, but also the trial that he was the Lamb of God, what would remove the sin of the world. John 1, verse 29. The shining garments are an anticipation of final victory about evil and resurrection that would come, where the purity of Christ would be fully manifested. Thus, this transfiguration scene anticipates the future glory of Christ, when he will be revealed in his entirety as the eternal King and the source of all light and salvation. The presence of Moses and Elijah alongside Jesus has a profound theological significance. They were not just there as historical figures or illustrious figures from the past. They represented the two pillars of Judaism, Moses the lawgiver and Elijah the prophet. The fact that these two were with Jesus emphasizes that he was not a foreign to Jewish tradition, but yes, the fulfillment of the scriptures. Jesus was the convergence of everything that God had previously revealed, both for law as for hair prophets. Moses, who represented the law, and Elijah, who represented the prophets, were there to validate and to recognize the mission of Jesus. The law and the prophets pointed to the coming of the Messiah, and now Jesus was there, fulfilling what had been promised. This moment of heavenly confirmation was not just for the disciples, but for all humanity. Jesus was not only in continuity with the Old Testament, but was the culmination of the history of salvation. The presence of Moses and Elijah reminds us that the redemption story does not begin with Jesus, but with the divine plan that unfolded over the centuries. This detail about Peter's reaction, a God's answer and others' revelation of transfiguration, deepens the understanding of the event as a moment of confirm the identity and mission of Jesus, fulfill the scriptures, and call disciples to a new understanding of divine work. Already Bible, mountains are more than simple geographic elevations. They have a deep meaning, being constantly associated with divine encounters and moments of spiritual revelation. The concept of mountains as portals between heaven and earth is something that permeates the biblical narrative, functioning as points of connection between the human and the divine. Throughout Scripture, mountains are not just physical locations, but spiritual seeking symbols, with a human being, in his smallness, rises to encounter the greatness of God. The Mount Sinai, for example, is where Moses had a dramatic encounter with God and received the law. It was in that place that the people of Israel witnessed the power of God in a manifestation of fire and thunder, marking the alliance between God and his people, Exodus 19. The Mount Carmelo, where the prophet Elias faced the prophets of Baal, is another striking example of a mountain-like place of confrontation and divine revelation, where God manifested himself in a powerful and decisive way. 1 Kings 18. Now, the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus reveals his divine glory to Peter, James, and John, goes down in history as another one of those transcendental meeting points. But what makes the Mount of Transfiguration different is that it is not just a place of revelation. He is a place of transition. Just as Moses received the law and Elijah confronted idolatry, in Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus himself, the Son of God, is revealed in his divine fullness, confirming his authority as the Messiah and the fulfillment of the Scriptures. Climbing a mountain in the biblical tradition is not just a geographic rise, but a spiritual ascension. The act of climbing a mountain is a metaphor for approach to God, a movement from the terrain of the mundane to the sacred. The physical distancing from the base of the mountain is a reflection of a spiritual detachment from everyday routine and earthly distractions, in search of something deeper, more eternal. In the Bible, this always suggests an inner search space, where the person is called to move away from normality and others seek a more intimate encounter with God. This departure from routine to encounter the sacred has a parallel with Christian life. Climb the mountain is the symbol of a call to holiness, to pureza, and to communion with the divine, away from the distractions of the world. Thus, the Mount of Transfiguration represents not only the place of a mystical experience, but also the moment of maximum revelation, where the disciples had the opportunity to see Jesus as he really was, in his glory and divinity, and to hear the voice of the Father affirming his redemptive mission. On a deeper level, the mountain is a place of spiritual renewal. Going up is also turn. When the disciples came down from that mountain, they were no longer the same. They had experienced a powerful revelation, and this experience could not leave them unchanged. Likewise, every encounter with the divine in a Christian's life is an invitation to rise spiritually, to move away from passing realities to reach something more eternal. After the extraordinary event of the Transfiguration, something intriguing happens. Jesus gives an order strange and apparently contradictory. Do not tell anyone what you saw until the Son of Man rises from the dead. Matthew 17, verse 9. Why does Jesus, having revealed his glory so clearly, now ask the disciples to keep silent about what you saw? This request for temporary silence, there's a reason deep and theological. Firstly, it is important to understand that, until that moment, the disciples still did not understand fully the mission of Jesus. They were beginning to understand that he was the Messiah, but the nature of his mission, especially the idea that he would be a suffering Messiah, it was still something that they couldn't understand. For them, the visible glory of Jesus on the mountain could have generated the expectation of a victorious and triumphant Messiah, someone who would come to reign immediately and free Israel from Roman rule. This vision wrong could have led to a misunderstanding of Jesus' true role as Salvador. The silence commanded by Jesus, therefore, has a pedagogical and protective purpose. Avoid premature disclosures about the Transfiguration would be a way to prevent people from forming wrong ideas about Jesus and his mission. They needed time to process what they had seen and understood. And most importantly, the complete mystery of the redemptive mission of Jesus would only be revealed when he rise from the dead. This silence, in fact, points to the need for gradual revelation of the mission of Jesus. full understanding of what the Transfiguration, as a reflection of the glorious resurrection of Christ, would only be possible when the disciples saw the resurrection in themselves. The death of Jesus and his resurrection would be the turning point which would completely reveal the nature of his ministry. However, the mystery goes beyond the need to protect against misunderstanding. On a deeper level, the Transfiguration is an anticipation of what would come. The radiance of Christ and the presence of Moses and Elijah were not merely to reaffirm his identity, but also to prepare the disciples for the greatness of what they were about to witness, the resurrection of Jesus. The silence what Jesus asks is, in fact, a form of keep the mystery until the time of your full disclosure. The Transfiguration anticipates the future glory of Jesus. But for this glory to be fully understood, the disciples would first need to go through the experience of suffering and from death of Jesus. Jesus' request that didn't say anything until after the resurrection also reflects the importance of resurrection, like the key moment of all the work of Christ. It is the resurrection that will give full meaning to his life, death, and transfiguration. Without the resurrection, the glory on the mountain, it would just be an impressive but incomplete event. The resurrection of Jesus is the point of convergence between the revealed glory and other salvation of the world. In this sense, the gag order reflects not only a teaching strategy, but also a way of protecting the true mission of Christ, which would only be understood in its entirety after the cross and resurrection. By expanding these points, we see how the mountain is a place of transcendental encounter with the divine. And as the silence after the Transfiguration, it was not just a precautionary measure, but part of a greater divine plan where the mystery of Christ would be revealed in his perfect time. Both moments point to the progressive revelation of the plan of salvation, where the glory of Christ and his redeeming mission, they would be fully understood only after the resurrection. After the Transfiguration, the way Jesus communicates his mission changes. Before, he spoke in an enigmatic way, but now he begins to speak clearly about your impending suffering. Jesus knew that time was running out and that his disciples needed to understand the true reason for his coming, the redeeming sacrifice. In Matthew 16, verse 21, Jesus begins to speak directly about his death and resurrection, preparing the disciples for what was to come. The Transfiguration is a memorable moment in the lives of Jesus and the disciples. She reveals the glory of Jesus, confirms his divine identity, and points to the redemptive mission that will culminate in the cross and resurrection. This mountaintop spiritual experience prepares the disciples for what is to come, while at the same time teaching us about the importance of faith and understanding divine purpose. If you like this video, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and continue with us watching more content about the life of Jesus and the impact of his mission on history and our lives. Click on one of the videos that will now appear on the screen to continue learning with us. Hugs, and may God bless you.